These are people who believed. They believed the Republican Party. They believed their Republican commander-in-chief. They didn't go to Washington, D.C. on a whim. They were summoned there by the President of the United States. The rally they were attending was called the Save America Rally. They chanted, "Stop the steal," as in stop the coup. Now, of course, it was a lie. But in their weird reality, they were heroes for answering the good president's call. And while each of them is different, every single one of them thought the election was being stolen because the President of the United States told them so. And let's just acknowledge that a big reason for that is that people trusted by society to tell us what's happening in the world, people we trust to inform us and put events into context for us, were instead serving political parties. And the ones serving the Republican Party did not explain to their viewers that they were being told lies. Donald Trump was not the only one lying to them. The people they trusted to explain the events of the world weren't informing them accurately. Quite the opposite. I think we need to solve the reality problem. But creating laws that punish people based on their ideas is not the answer. And that's what terrorism laws do.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 236th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, this is a podcast about Congress, and I'm not a member of either of the two big political parties. I am just a taxpayer who wants to know what they're doing with my money and in my name, and I've been doing this weird job now for 9 years, where I read bills and laws and watch lots of hearings and just tell you the stuff that I wish the news was telling me. And so today's episode is one that, to be completely honest with you, I'm kind of dreading to release to you because it's about the January 6th riot that took place at the Capitol, which is a subject that, based on my Twitter feed and inbox for the last 6 months, still conjures up extreme emotions in people that are directed at me when we disagree. But January 6th is a story that will not go away because the Democrats will not let it. We have an unnecessary commission being created right now with so much partisan drama to investigate the events of the day, despite the fact that Congress, using committees that already exist and are perfectly capable of completing investigations, well, committees that already exist have already held at least 11 hearings on the events of January 6th. In fact, the Senate has already issued a 128-page report that told me everything I needed to know about the riot. Now, there are still questions, many questions I know, about then President Donald Trump's actions in his attempt to remain president despite losing the election. But as far as January 6th is concerned, which was one act in a string of acts that was Donald Trump's months-long attempt to remain president, but as for that riot on January 6th, I feel like I have the answers I was looking for to my questions. Who were these rioters? Why were they there? How the hell did they get into the building? Where was the National Guard? And did Trump delay the law enforcement response to help the rioters? That one was key for me. And now I know the answers to all of those questions. And so today I'm going to share testimony collected from 11 hearings, collected from over 30 hours of testimony that took place in the Senate and the House. Every one of these hearings bipartisan. But you're going to hear what I heard, or at least the highlights of it. I'm not going to play you 30 hours of testimony, but I'm going to tell you, or at least let you hear for yourself, the important parts of those hearings today. And if you suspect that I'm editing this unfairly, because with 30 hours of testimony, of course I have to cherry pick in order to summarize this in the hour, maybe two, that I'm trying to squeeze this into. Well, what I have done is I've put all the timestamps and transcripts of my sound clips in the show notes for you, including the clips that I collected but didn't put in the episode. But you can easily use that information to find the conversations you want to hear in full for yourself, even buried inside hearings that are 5 hours long. I also included all of the documents, documentaries, podcast episodes, articles, everything that I used to research this episode. Because trust is earned, right? And this is my way of attempting to earn yours. And yes, this took a lot of work. This is my full-time job, and if you get value from my work, please pay whatever amount you feel represents the value you receive using any of the payment methods you like. You get to choose, which are all listed in the show notes for you on your podcast app or on congressionaldish.com. And also, please, if you haven't already, if you do appreciate my work, please rate the show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, because the most recent reviews on there were written by some truly miserable folks who said that they like the research, they like the episodes that I give to them, but they resent the few minutes that I take in these episodes where I ask to be paid for my work, as if I'm some kind of asshole for wanting to keep my show free of corporate influence, giving it away for free, and asking for payment on the honor system. And so if you don't resent me for trying to make a living this way, please go to Apple Podcasts and cancel out some of those reviews by rating the show 5 stars and saying what you think. Unless what you think is something negative, in which case, why do you have to go and hurt me? Please don't do that. And maybe I'm just begging for more negative reviews by saying this up top, but I know that most of you guys are not vindictive, shitty people, and so it would be really appreciated if the producers of this show could let people know that you like it. And I also need your help marketing the show, so please tell your friends, and yeah, we need so many things over here. But anyway, let's get into the episode. So this episode, like I said, is everything I think you need to know about the riot itself. And if you want to watch some of the hearings for yourself, I highly recommend the Senate hearings, where 2 committees, the House Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and the Committee on Rules and Administration, they conducted a really informative joint investigation where members of both parties behaved as if they were genuinely interested in getting information. Their investigation has resulted in a 128-page report, which of course is in the show notes for you, detailing what happened on January 6th, what problems led to the security failures that allowed the approximately 800 rioters to enter the Capitol building and successfully disrupt Congress, and it also included their proposed solutions to the problems that they discovered. But if you don't want to watch tens of hours of hearings yourself, here's how the Senate described what happened on January 6th in the report that they produced after their investigation. Quote, on November 7th, with some states still counting votes, the major news networks projected that Joe Biden had secured enough electoral votes to win the 2020 presidential election. In response, President Trump issued a statement that he planned to pursue legal challenges to election results in certain states. Nearly all cases were ultimately dismissed or withdrawn. By December 14th, all 50 states and the District of Columbia had certified their respective election results, which totaled 306 electoral votes for Biden and 232 for Donald Trump. Following the state certification, President Trump continued to assert that the election was stolen from him. His statements focused on the January 6th counting of the Electoral College votes during a joint session of Congress. The process in Congress on January 6th is based on a federal law that allows Congress to consider objections to a state's certification of its electors. If both a member of the House and a member of the Senate object to a state's certification of electors, it requires a congressional vote on whether to reject that state's electors. Congress has only voted on objections twice in the 133 years since enacting this statute prior to 2020. Pro-Trump groups planned rallies for January 6th that President Trump promoted. And on January 5th, President Trump announced that he would speak during the Save America rally at the White House ellipse, unquote. Now, if you want to understand the process that took place in Congress on January 6th, check out episode 226, where I summarized the lame duck session of Congress, during which I explained the usually ceremonial process of certifying the electors that took place on January 6th, the proceeding that the rioters disrupted, which is a process itself that has been exposed as problematic in this whole January 6th debacle that no one seems to want to do anything about in this Congress. But that's a rant for another day. But if you want to know what Congress was doing, and in fact, that other day, that rant has actually happened. So listen to episode 226 and you'll understand why everything that was going on in Congress on January 6th is the result of a very weird law that probably shouldn't be a thing. Okay. But regardless of what was happening in Congress, for his own reasons, Donald Trump, for weeks, asked his supporters to travel to Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And on the night before, he announced that he himself would be speaking to the crowd in person around the time the certification would be beginning. But here's one of the things that I learned about that rally. So here's Robert Conti. He was the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department, which is the police force that protects and serves the whole city of Washington, D.C. This was his testimony on February 23rd.
Since Mayor Bowser declared a public health emergency last March, the district has not issued permits for any large gathering. Although the district and MPD take pride in facilitating the exercise of First Amendment rights by all groups, regardless of their beliefs, none of the public gatherings on January 5th and 6th were issued permits by the city.
That rally was illegal. You know, I took part in a protest in Washington, D.C. once where I was arrested in front of the White House. I was handcuffed and brought to jail for processing, where I paid $100 and was immediately released. It wasn't a big deal. But I was arrested for standing still in front of the White House. And I can't remember the exact wording on my ticket, but it was something along the lines of failure to obey a lawful order to disperse in front of a Capitol building, something like that. Well, in Washington, D.C., events with more than 25 people are required to get a permit. A march with more than 100 participants that want to go into the street, not just use the sidewalks, that also requires a permit. And Donald Trump and the people that were organizing this with him, they did not get a permit for their rally. Now, some organization called the Women for America First did apply for one, but it wasn't granted. And I don't know what the penalties are for organizing a rally with thousands of people without a permit in Washington, D.C. But if I can be arrested for standing still on the sidewalk, it seems to me that coordinating an illegal event with thousands of people would be an arrestable event too. But Donald Trump has not been arrested by the Metropolitan Police or the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police is the police force, which is the only law enforcement agency that polices the Capitol complex, which is 2 square miles that includes the congressional buildings, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, and the parks surrounding those buildings. And you're going to hear a lot about the Capitol Police today. They were ultimately the ones who failed on January 6th to stop the riot from getting into the Capitol building. The Capitol Police have approximately 1,840 officers and a budget of more than $500 million per year. Now, for some perspective, that budget is close to the budget of the Metropolitan Police in Washington, D.C., which is the police force for the 61 square miles that make up the rest of the city of Washington, D.C., which is over 30 times the size of the property that the Capitol Police protects. Basically, the Capitol Police are a wealthy police squad with a small jurisdiction. The Capitol Police are governed by the Capitol Police Board. The board determines salaries, appoints officials, fires employees, so basically acts as HR, but they also manage the Capitol Police law enforcement authorities. The Capitol Police Board is made up of 3 voting members. One of them is the House Sergeant at Arms, who on January 6th was Paul Irving, who has since resigned. But the House Sergeant at Arms is the chief law enforcement officer in the House of Representatives. He is chosen by the Speaker of the House and elected by the House members. Similarly, the second voting member on the Capitol Police Board is the Senate Sergeant at Arms. On January 6th, that was a man named Michael Stenger, who has also since resigned. The Senate Sergeant at Arms is the chief law enforcement officer in the Senate, chosen by the Senate Majority Leader and elected by the senators. The third voting member of the Capitol Police Board is the architect of the Capitol, who is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But it doesn't matter who that was on January 6th, and you'll understand why very soon. But when looking at what happened on January 6th, I think this sentiment expressed to Congress on February 4th by Elizabeth Newman, who's the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, I think she accurately describes what a lot of us were thinking.
It just makes no sense to me that there were so few, such a low law enforcement presence at the Capitol, that there wasn't a stronger perimeter security, that those law enforcement officers present didn't have riot gear. They're just basic things that we have learned over the last 20 years, that a strong deterrence often avoids violence, and that was not present on January 6th. So somewhere somebody made a bad judgment call.
Well, the people that had to make those calls were called into Congress and had to explain themselves. And so first up, here's Stephen Sund. On January 6th, he was the chief of the U.S. Capitol Police.
The intelligence that we based our planning on indicated that the January 6th protests were expected to be similar to the previous MAGA rallies in 2020, which drew tens of thousands of participants.
And here's Captain Carnicia Mendoza. She was the field commander of the Capitol Police Special Operations Division.
On January 6th, we anticipated an event similar to the Million MAGA March that took place on November 14th, where we would likely face groups fighting among one another.
Here's Paul Irving. He's the now former Sergeant at Arms of the House of Representatives and one of the 3 voting members of the Capitol Police Board on January 6th.
We began planning for the protests of January 6th in December 2020. The planning relied on what we understood to be credible intelligence provided by various state and federal agencies, including a special event assessment issued by the Capitol Police on January 3rd. The January 3rd assessment forecast that the protests were, quote, expected to be similar to the previous Million MAGA March rallies that had taken place in November and December 2020. Every Capitol Police daily intelligence report between January 4 and January 6th, including on January 6th, forecast the chance of civil disobedience or arrest during the protests as remote to improbable.
But it turns out that they didn't have all of the available information. Here's Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon.
January 5th, the FBI issued a report through the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which includes going to the U.S. Capitol Police. And that report noted that on far-right media, the threats included things such as, the comments such as, be ready to fight. Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in, blood from their BLM and Antifa, slaves, soldiers being spilled. Get violent. Stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest. Go, they're ready for war. We get our president or we die. Nothing else will achieve this goal.
And so the FBI did have this report. And here's what the FBI said about it. Here's Jill Sanborn. She's the assistant director for the counterterrorism division at the FBI.
The piece of information we received, again, was a non-attributable posting to a message board. And so very raw, very unvetted. We actually didn't receive that information until late, very late in the afternoon on the 5th and almost into the evening. And because of our emphasis on we need any intelligence, even though it was raw, unattributed, and unvetted, the Norfolk office quickly wrote that up specifically in a document following our processes to disseminate that. So a situation information report is for the intentional purpose of sharing that with state and local partners. Not only did they write that up because they knew how important it was to get that information out into hands of folks that might need it, our state and local partners. Within 40 minutes, they sent an email to the Washington field office with that information, and Washington field office also then followed up with an email to all task force officers. And so several different mechanisms were happened here. And, we like to use the phrase belt and suspenders. We didn't want to make sure that one method of communication failed. So we wrote it up in the document for dissemination. We sent it in an email to all task force officers in the National Capital Region, and that does include Washington Metro as well as Capital. But again, not wanting to rely on those two mechanisms only, it was then briefed verbally in a command post, an interagency command post, that we were doing briefings every couple of hours so that every agency in that command post had what we call a common operating picture, knowing what all of us knew at any given time. It was briefed at 8 p.m. on the evening of the 5th. And then taking it one step further, because we didn't want to limit our aperture to just the National Capital Region, because there's collection opportunity out there for all state and local partners and federal partners to help us. We loaded that suspicious information report into what we call the LEAP portal, and that is accessible by all state and local partners. So we really tried in various ways to make sure that we did not rely on one communication mechanism and really tried to rely on several so that the information would get to the right people.
It seems to me like the FBI did take multiple steps to get that information to the people who needed it. And so what happened? Well, here is Stephen Sund. Like I said, on January 6th, he was the chief of the Capitol Police. He's going to be speaking to Senator Amy Klobuchar, and then Klobuchar is going to ask some questions of the 2 members of the Capitol Police Board who are also in charge of security of Congress, Michael Stenger, who was the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate, and Paul Irving, who's the Sergeant at Arms of the House.
I actually, just in the last 24 hours, was informed by the department that they actually had received that report. It was received by what we call one of our sworn members that's assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is a task force with the FBI. They received it the evening of the 5th, reviewed it, and then forwarded it over to an official at the intelligence division over at U.S. Capitol Police Headquarters.
And so you hadn't seen it yourself?
No, ma'am. It did not go any further than that.
Okay. And then was it sent to the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms?
I don't believe it went any farther than from the over to the sergeant at the intelligence division.
Okay. And Mr. Irving, Mr. Stanger, did you get that report beforehand? Mr. Stanger, did you get the report?
No.
Okay. Mr. Irving.
I did not.
Okay.
So the report was out there, but it just stopped somewhere in the communication pipeline. Here's more from Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund.
I think that information would have been helpful to be aware of. Again, looking at the information for the first time yesterday, it is strictly raw data. It's raw intelligence information that has come in, seen on a social media post. Lots of people post things on social media that need to be, corroborated and confirmed. So it's coming in as raw data. So please keep that in mind. But I agree that's something we need to look at. What's the process and how do we streamline that information getting to where it needs to go?
So there was a missing report that maybe would have made them prepare more. But even without that report, Twitter's public. I knew January 6th had potential to be a day of Trumpian chaos. And so what did they do to prepare with the information that they did have? Here's Paul Irving, the former Sergeant at Arms of the House of Representatives, and again, one of the 3 voting members on the Capitol Police Board.
The chief's plan took on an all-hands-on-deck approach whereby every available sworn Capitol Police employee with police powers was assigned to work on January 6th. That meant approximately 1,200 Capitol Police officers were on site, including civil disturbance units and other tactical teams. I also understood that 125 National Guard troops were on notice to be standing by for a quick response. The Metropolitan Police Department was also on 12-hour shifts with no officers on day off or leave, and they staged officers just north of the Capitol to provide immediate assistance if required. The plan was briefed to multiple law enforcement partners. Based on the intelligence, we all believed that the plan met the threat.
But the preparation problems were even more systemic than that. Here's Senator Portman of Ohio speaking to former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund.
But what about preparedness? We've received information that prior to January 6th, Capitol police officers were not trained on how to respond to an infiltration of the Capitol building. Is that correct, Mr. Sund?
When you talk about infiltration, you talk about a large insurrection like we saw on the January 6th? No.
And here's some more. Here's Senator Jeff Merkley of Ohio speaking again to Capitol Police Chief Sund.
Have you ever held a drill to respond to this situation where a crowd pushes past the exterior barricades?
Not this level of situation, no, sir.
To what level have you had such drills?
We've done various exercises with people, activities on the grounds during civil disobedience training, how to handle riotous groups.
Okay,
So they never practiced for a situation where protesters or rioters try to get into the Capitol building? Really? How is that possible? Well, here's Michael Bolton. No, not that one, silly. This Michael Bolton is the Inspector General of the U.S. Capitol Police. And after his investigation, this is what he told Congress on June 16th.
To me, the biggest failure is that because we have allowed certain elements within the Capitol Police to be autonomous, they conduct their own training.
Okay.
That's the issue. Whereas if you have a training services bureau, let's call it an office of training, that is fully incorporated, they handle all the training. They conduct it. They make sure you get the training. They hold your officials accountable. Your people didn't get training, guess what? We're sending a letter to the chief, and they can no longer work until they get recalled, or what have you.
And so there's one problem identified with an actionable solution. Let's hope something is actually done about that. But here's a clip from Brian Jenkins. He was called to testify on February 4th to Congress, and he is the senior advisor to the RAND president at the RAND Corporation. And here's what he said that I think just really got to the heart of what the issue was on January 6th.
The problem is that clearly the defenders of the Capitol were badly outnumbered. That was simply, I think it is that issue. Now, a commission can investigate this further, but just having a greater number of people on the exterior, as well as, and I think this is one thing that I don't see in the response, is that there should have been inner perimeters as well. In other words, the presumption that what if they break through that outer line? What if they break through the doors? Now we're dealing with them inside. Do we have prepared security within the Capitol building as opposed to around the Capitol building that will protect the officials and their staffs that are threatened by this action?
Seems to be an easy enough lesson to learn. What's shocking to me is that it wasn't obvious to the Capitol Police before. Speaking of before, there were some who attempted to be better prepared. Remember, there are multiple law enforcements in this story. The Capitol Police and the Capitol Police Board were in charge of the 2 miles making up the Capitol complex. The D.C. Mayor and the Metropolitan Police were in charge of the city of Washington, D.C. And the D.C. National Guard is the military unit that exists on standby for when extraordinary numbers of law enforcement personnel are required. The city managers knew that some backup would be necessary. Here's Representative James Comer of Kentucky talking to Lieutenant General Walter Piatt, who is the director of the Army staff.
On December 31st, Mayor Bowser requested D.C. National Guard assistance with the planned protest for January 5th and 6th, correct?
Correct, sir.
And was that request for assistance ultimately approved by the Secretary of Army?
It was, and it approved by the Acting Secretary of Defense as well.
Were restrictions placed on that authority upon the request of Mayor Bowser? And if so, what were those restrictions?
She had requested that they be unarmed and that they not take place in any law enforcement activities.
In response to that request by the D.C. Mayor, here's what the Defense Department did. Here's Robert Salesis, who on January 6th was the senior official performing the duties of the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense and Global Security at the U.S. Department of Defense.
After consultation with the Department of Justice, the Acting Secretary of Defense approved the D.C. government request for National Guard personnel to support 30 traffic control points and 6 metro stations from January 5th to the 6th. The acting secretary also authorized a 40-person quick reaction force to be readied at Joint Base Andrews.
On top of that, the Department of Defense also took this extra step.
Over the weekend of January 2nd and 3rd, my staff contacted the Secret Service, the Park Police, the Marshal Service, the FBI, the Capitol Police, to determine if they plan to request DoD assistance. None of these law enforcement agencies indicated a need for DoD or D.C. National Guard support.
And then the day before the riot,
on January 5th, the Acting Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army received a letter from the Mayor of D.C. stating MPD is prepared and coordinated with its federal partners, namely the Park Police, the Capitol Police, and the Secret Service. Based on these communications with federal and local civilian authorities, DoD determined that no additional military support was required on January 5th and 6th.
And so the city of Washington, D.C. requested a small number of National Guard troops to be unarmed and on standby. But what about the Capitol Police? Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota speaking to Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund.
Mr. Sund, you stated in your written testimony that you first made a request for the Capitol Police Board to declare an emergency and authorize National Guard support on Monday, January 4th, and that request was not granted.
That is correct, ma'am.
Hey, Paul Irving, Sergeant at Arms of the House of Representatives and one of the 3 voting members on the Capitol Police Board, explain yourself to Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri.
Chief Sund called me to tell me that he had received an offer from the National Guard to provide us 125 unarmed troops to work traffic control in the perimeter of the Capitol. Shortly after that discussion, I said, let's include Sergeant at Arms Stanger as chair of the board and another senior official with quite a bit of experience. The three of us talked it through. And during that call, the number one question on the table was, did the intelligence support it? Did the intelligence support that additional offer for those 125 troops?
Did you discuss this with anybody except Sergeant Armstanger and Chief Sund?
No, it was just this one phone call. And during that call, we all agreed that the intelligence did not support the troops and collectively decided to let it go. Michael Stenger then said, how about we put him on standby just in case? And that's what we ended up doing.
So there never was a formal meeting of the Capitol Police Board to even discuss the need for the National Guard before January 6th. And the third voting member of the board, the architect of the Capitol, was never consulted at all, which is why I didn't need to bother to look up his name. And here's the repercussions of their decisions. Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar speaking to Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund.
Mr. Sund, your written testimony states that you had no authority to request the assistance of the National Guard without an emergency declaration of the Capitol Police Board. On what rule, regulation, or authority did you base that view?
I'd have to go back and look the specific rule, but it's a standing rule that we have. I cannot request the National Guard without a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board. It's kind of interesting because it's very similar to the fact, I can't even give my men and women cold water on an excessively hot day without a declaration of emergency. It's just a process that's in place.
And so, in the middle of a riot, the chief of the Capitol Police was trying to get a hold of all three members of the Capitol Police Board for authorization to call the National Guard, which is ridiculous because two of them, the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms, were in charge of protecting the House and Senate floors that were being breached and evacuated. They were kind of busy, which is why this type of stuff needs to be done ahead of time. Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar speaking to Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund.
Your testimony makes clear that the current structure of the Capitol Police Board resulted in delays in bringing in assistance from the National Guard. Would you agree with that? That's one of the things we want to look at.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And here's the thing. The Capitol Police Board didn't just delay communications and, a working relationship between the Capitol Police and the National Guard. They also played middleman between the National Guard and the Metropolitan Police Department. Here's Robert Conti, who is the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department on January 6th.
MPD is prohibited by federal law from entering the Capitol or its grounds to patrol, make arrests, or serve warrants without the consent or request of the Capitol Police Board.
And so if they can't be reached, well, I guess they can't do anything. So basically, that Capitol Police Board is a major problem. Also, an obvious thing here is that the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms, Paul Irving and Michael Stenger, didn't take the threat of Trump loyalist chaos nearly seriously enough. And they both resigned pretty much immediately after the riot. Good riddance. But there are structural problems here too. Because I don't understand why the chief of police is not allowed to do his damn job without asking pretty please for so many basic things from his House and Senate daddies. And at least Senator Amy Klobuchar and I seem to be on the same page on this. Here she is again talking to former Capitol Police Chief Sund.
Do you think that changes are needed to make clear that the Capitol Police Chief has the authority to call in the National Guard?
I certainly do. I think in exigent circumstances, there needs to be a streamlined process for the Capitol Chief of Police for the Capitol Police to have authority.
So we'll have to see if Congress actually writes any bills to remove the Capitol Police Board from their middleman position. But regardless, it's clear that the Capitol Police and Capitol Police Board in particular did not prepare enough for the possibility of a riot. Like ever, not just on January 6th. And so here's how the Senate report describes what happened on that day. Quote, on the morning of January 6th, thousands of people began gathering across Washington, D.C. Law enforcement agencies, including the U.S. Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department, were monitoring the demonstrators as early as 6 a.m. and releasing demonstration updates throughout the day. Most demonstrators headed to the Ellipse near the White House for the Save America rally, where then President Trump would speak. By 10:30 a.m., a U.S. Capitol Police demonstration update indicated that somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 people were at the Ellipse. The 10:30 a.m. U.S. Capitol Police update also noted that organizers of the rally planned to march to the Capitol after the president's speech. In addition to those demonstrators at the Ellipse, other demonstrators headed directly to the Capitol complex. By 11 a.m., U.S. Capitol Police was aware of large crowds around the Capitol building, including a group of approximately 200 Proud Boys. Throughout the city, law enforcement agencies were aware of and responding to reports of suspicious packages and individuals with firearms. President Trump began his address just before noon. During the next 75 minutes, the president continued his claims of election fraud and encouraged his supporters to go to the Capitol. Before the president finished his address, crowds began leaving the Ellipse for the Capitol. U.S. Capitol Police received reports of a very large group heading to the U.S. Capitol from eastbound on Pennsylvania Avenue. By 12:45 p.m., what looked like a wall of people suddenly arrived about a block west of the Capitol. At the same time, U.S. Capitol Police received a report of a pipe bomb at the Republican National Committee headquarters, unquote. Now, in my conversations with people over the last 6 months, the pipe bombs come up a lot by those who are committed to branding January 6th as an insurrection. And I kind of get that. Because one of my criteria when judging if something is an insurrection, a attempted overthrow of the government by enemies of the state, one of my criteria is the level of firepower brought to that attack. Pipe bombs do indicate that the bad guys are fucking serious. But what I didn't know until hearing the testimony was the details about where the bombs were, and I think the details are important. So here's Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma talking to Stephen Sund, the former chief of the U.S. Capitol Police.
You had said in this, you talked several times about thousands of well-coordinated, well-equipped, violent criminals and described them with climbing gear and all the things that you've also testified here. You also mentioned this letter about the pipe bombs that were located, that the first word would come at 12:52 that a pipe bomb had been located at the Republican National Committee headquarters. How was that located? Who found it, and why was that particular moment the moment that it was found?
I don't know why that was a particular moment that was found. I believe it was an employee of the Republican National Committee that had located it in the rear of the building that had called it into Capitol Police headquarters.
You had mentioned before that you thought this was part of the coordination, that there were several that were out there that would take away resources at that exact moment. But there's no way to know that they would find it at that exact moment. I'm glad they did find it. They found another one at the Democrat headquarters as well at 1:50, and you document that as well. But you had to send quite a few individuals to be able to go to the RNC and the DNC to be able to go deal with those explosives that were planted there. Is that correct?
That is correct. And just for your information, the RNC pipe bomb, that was one that was really run by Capitol Police. The DNC Metropolitan ended up taking that and running that so we can run two concurrently. That resulted in the evacuation of two congressional buildings, the Cannon House Office building as well as one of the Library of Congress buildings. So it took extensive resources.
So the assaults in the Capitol is not what caused the evacuation of those buildings. The discovery of those pipe bombs is what caused the evacuation of those buildings.
That is correct, sir.
I didn't know that the bombs were placed at the RNC and the DNC. They were targeting the leadership of both of our two main political parties. Both of them. And notably, those bombs were not at the Capitol building. And also, there's this. Here's Representative Glenn Grothman of Wisconsin speaking to Robert Contley, the chief of the Metropolitan Police Department. They are having this conversation on May 12th.
Has there been any progress made at all on who would have put these bombs there?
No arrests have been made, no suspects identified. Working with our partners on the federal side, there's been surveillance videos that have been released publicly showing that individual placing the pipe bombs, but no arrests have been made at this point.
And I checked, and that still remains the case. They do, however, have video of the person who planted the bombs. They were planted near the RNC and DNC buildings around 8 p.m. on January 5th, the night before the riot. And I put the FBI's video in the show notes for you if you want to see it. It's quite boring, but it's there. But the main takeaway for me is that they don't know who placed those bombs or if there was any connection to the rioters at all. The fact that the bombs were placed at the Republican headquarters, like, why would the Republican rioters bomb their own political team? So basically, the pipe bomb thing, it's a whole bunch of question marks. And so please stop using that as evidence of insurrection, because there is no proof of that. And while we're on the subject of the lethal weapons brought to the Capitol, the Senate report does go on to say, quote, While responding to these explosive devices, U.S. Capitol Police officers discovered a vehicle containing a firearm and 11 Molotov cocktails, unquote. Those weapons were found in the pickup truck owned by 70-year-old Lonnie Kaufman of Alabama. The night before the riot, Kaufman was driving around D.C. looking for Senator Ted Cruz's house. He also wanted to get in contact with Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, and Rush Limbaugh because he wanted to inform them about all the election fraud that he said he knew about. He parked and left most of his weapons in the car when he participated in the march on January 6th. While investigating the bomb at the Republican National Committee, police happened to walk by Lonnie's parked pickup truck and noticed it was full of illegal weapons. There were 11 homemade Molotov cocktail type bomb-ish devices. There was a rifle, a shotgun, 2 9mm pistols, and a .22 caliber pistol, all of them loaded, as well as a crossbow, several machetes, a stun gun, and smoke devices. In his pickup truck, along with all those weapons, he had a handwritten note that said, quote, "We the people are the rightful masters of both the Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution," unquote. Lonnie Coleman has been in jail since January 6th and has been charged with 17 counts of possession of an unregistered firearm, unlawful possession of ammunition, carrying a pistol without a license, and other similar charges, which means he's likely to spend quite a bit more time in a cage. Back to the report. Quote, "At the Capitol, a large group amassed near the Capitol reflecting pool. At approximately 12:53 p.m., individuals within that group picked up one of the metal bike racks that demarcated U.S. Capitol Police's security perimeter and shoved it into the U.S. Capitol Police officer standing guard. This marked the initial breach of U.S. Capitol Police's outer security perimeter. Crowds began to flow into the Capitol's west front grounds," unquote. So that happened at 12:53. 10 minutes later, Vice President Mike Pence gavelled in the joint session of Congress, and 7 minutes after that, President Trump finished his speech. At 2:11 p.m., the rioters entered the Capitol building when rioters smashed the windows on the first floor of the Capitol building's south side and then kicked open the nearby doors to let other rioters in. The Senate went into recess and was evacuated 2 minutes after that at 2:13 p.m., and the House recessed and began evacuating at 2:18 p.m. Now, I was watching this whole thing unfold from the beginning, and it was shortly after this when Joe and I started asking each other, where the fuck is the National Guard? And wondering out loud if they weren't showing up because President Trump was somehow holding them back. Well, here's what the fuck happened with the National Guard. So first of all, the National Guard command structure in Washington, D.C. is unique. Here's Robert Conti, the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department, on January 6th.
The President of the United States, not the Mayor of the District of Columbia, controls the D.C. National Guard.
Which is why we were wondering if President Trump was using his authority to keep the National Guard away to maybe help his rioters stay inside the Capitol. And Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York was wondering that too. Here she is on May 12th questioning the guy who was our defense secretary on January 6th, Chris Miller.
Mr. Miller, you were the acting secretary of defense on January 6th. Did President Trump, as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, call you during the January 6th attack to ensure the Capitol was being secured? Mr. Miller.
No, I had all the authority I needed from the president to fulfill my constitutional duties.
Did you speak with President Trump at all as the attack was unfolding?
On January 6th?
Yes.
No, I did not. I didn't need to. I had all the authority I needed and knew what had to happen. I knew what had to happen.
Did you speak with Vice President Pence during the attack, yes or no?
Yes.
According to a Defense Department timeline, it was Vice President Pence and not President Trump who called during the siege to say the Capitol was not secure and to give you the direction to, quote, clear the Capitol. What specifically did Vice President Pence say to you that day?
Vice President's not in the chain of command. He did not direct me to clear the Capitol. I discussed very briefly with him the situation. He provided insights based on his presence there, and I notified him, or I informed him that by that point, the District of Columbia National Guard was being fully mobilized and was in coordination with local and federal law enforcement to assist in clearing the Capitol.
The Senate report says that President Trump gave the authority to activate the National Guard on January 3rd. And on January 6th, here's Senator Hank Johnson of Georgia questioning Defense Secretary Miller.
were you ordered to delay deployment of troops?
110% absolutely not. No, that is not the case.
And so if it wasn't Donald Trump that delayed the National Guard, who was it? Well, here's who was in charge that day. Here's Robert Salesses, who is the senior official performing the duties of the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense and Global Security at the U.S. Department of Defense on January 6th.
The only decision makers on the 6th of January were the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy. There was a chain of command from the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary McCarthy, to General Walker. That was the chain of command.
And when it comes to the National Guard, that is a unique to Washington, D.C. thing. Here's Robert Conti again, who was the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department on January 6th.
So the mayor does not have full authority over the National Guard to include their activation or deployment. When the mayor, we make a request as the District of Columbia, we make a request, we send that to the federal government. Ultimately, the Secretary of the Army receives that request. There's a whole approval process that request has to go through in order for National Guard resources to be deployed to the District of Columbia. Unlike governors in other states who are able to activate their National Guard without going through those approval processes and receiving approval from the highest level of the federal government, that just does not have to take place in other states. So a real hindrance to us in terms of response and the ability to call them up.
So the D.C. National Guard troops have to be ordered by the heads of the Defense Department. So there were middlemen in this situation too. So now, knowing that, let's remind ourselves of what the D.C. mayor had requested from the Defense Department for January 5th and 6th. Here's Robert Salesses of the Defense Department.
After consultation with the Department of Justice, the acting Secretary of Defense approved the D.C. government request for National Guard personnel to support 30 traffic control points and 6 metro stations from January 5th to the 6th. The acting secretary also authorized a 40-person quick reaction force to be readied at Joint Base Andrews.
And so let's hone in on the quick reaction force right now. Here's Major General William Walker, a take no bullshit kind of guy who was the commander of the D.C. National Guard on January 6th. And I love this dude from a few good men kind of way. And here's some of his testimony to Congress.
Now, a quick reaction force normally is a commander's tool to go help either a civilian agency, but more typically to help the National Guardsmen who are out there and need assistance.
And here's what he said happened to the quick reaction force that was on standby as requested by the mayor of D.C. on January 6th.
The District of Columbia National Guard provides support to the Metropolitan Police Department, the United States Park Police, the United States Secret Service, and other federal and district law enforcement agencies in response to planned rallies, marches, protests, and other large-scale First Amendment activity on a routine basis. A standard component of such support is the stand-up of an off-site quick reaction force, an element of guardsmen held in reserve with civil disturbance response equipment, helmets, shields, batons, etc. They are postured to quickly respond to an urgent and immediate need for assistance by civil authorities. The Secretary of the Army's January 5th letter to me withheld that authority for me to employ a quick reaction force. Additionally, the Secretary of the Army's memorandum to me required that a concept of operation be submitted to him before the employment of a quick reaction force. I found that requirement to be unusual, as was the requirement to seek approval to move guardsmen supporting the Metropolitan Police Department to move from one traffic control point to another.
Middlemen. More needed authority requests before action could be taken. Here's Senator Rob Portman of Ohio asking more questions of Major General Walker.
This morning, you have testified that you received this letter from Army Secretary McCarthy on January 5th, so just the day before the attack on the Capitol. In that letter, did Secretary McCarthy prohibit you from employing the National Guard's quick reaction force without his authorization?
So I have the letter in front of me, and his letter does not, but it is the Secretary of Defense says that I have to use it as a last resort. But the Secretary of the Army told me, and it's I have the letter, that I could not use the quick reaction force. I'll just read it.
Yeah.
I withhold authority to approve employment of the District of Columbia National Guard Quick Reaction Force and will do so only as a last resort in response to a request from an appropriate civil authority.
Yeah.
I will require a concept of operation prior to authorizing employment of a quick reaction force.
And I'm just going to keep playing you clips related to this because I think his clarifications are important.
So the memo was unusual in that it required me to seek authorization from the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense to essentially even protect my guardsmen. So no civil disturbance equipment could be authorized unless it came from the Secretary of Defense. Now, the Secretary of the Army, to his credit, did tell me that I could have force protection equipment with the guardsmen. So we did have helmets, shin guards, vest. We did have that with us, but that came from the Secretary of the Army. The Secretary of Defense told me I needed his permission to escalate to have that kind of protection. What it says, without my personal authorization, the District of Columbia National Guard is not authorized the following: to be issued weapons, ammunition, bayonets, batons, or ballistic protection equipment such as helmets and body armor. Now, again, to be clear, the Secretary of the Army told me to go ahead and issue that equipment. So we never were going to have weapons or ammunition, and we no longer have bayonets. But we do have ballistic protection equipment, helmets, body armor. And so I did have that with each guardsman.
Thank you, General.
I mean, my God, they were micromanaging the commander's equipment. Here's Senator Rob Portman of Ohio again, speaking to Major General Walker.
That January 4th memorandum from Acting Secretary Miller to the Army Secretary required the personal approval of the Secretary of Defense for the National Guard to be issued riot gear. Is that correct?
That's correct. But the Secretary of the Army told me to go ahead and put it in the vehicles.
Yeah.
So I give him credit for that.
And Major General Walker emphasized repeatedly that these requirements for approvals from the heads of the military were not normal.
Normally, for a safety and force protection matter, a commander would be able to authorize his guardsmen to protect themselves with helmet and protective equipment.
And this went beyond equipment. I mean, the commander of the DC National Guard had to get permission to deploy the troops. This is the reason the National Guard was delayed. Here's Major General William Walker again speaking to Senator Rob Portman of Ohio.
And just to be clear, the Secretary of Defense said I could use it as a last resort.
Last resort, right.
But the Secretary of the Army says that I could only use it after he gave me permission, and only then after a concept of operation was.
And we talked about the chain of command earlier. So your chain of command is both of these gentlemen. In other words, you didn't have the authority to deploy that quick reaction force based on either the letter or the earlier memo that went from the Secretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of Defense, to the Secretary of the Army. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
I mean, the micromanagement on January 6th was simply absurd. Check this out.
Yeah, I also thought it was odd, and I think you said it was unusual and very prescriptive, that the January 5th letter required the Secretary of the Army to approve the movement of deployed guardsmen from one traffic control point to another. Did you find that unusual?
19 years, I never had that before happen. So on that day, the Metropolitan Police, as they would any other day, requested that a traffic control point move one block over. No traffic was where they were, so they wanted the traffic control point to move one block. I had to get permission. I told them, I'll get back to you. I contacted Lieutenant General Piatt, who contacted the Secretary of the Army. I had to explain where that traffic control point was in relationship to the Capitol. And only then did I get permission to move the three National Guardsmen supporting the Metropolitan Police.
These are three unarmed National Guardsmen who are helping with traffic control, in part so that Metropolitan Police can do other things. and they were not permitted to move a block away without getting permission from the Secretary of the Army. Is that true?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's absurd. And so now, knowing that there were hurdles put in place by the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Army on what the commander of the National Guard troops could do, here's what happened on January 6th. Here's Robert Conti, the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department.
Just sometime after 2:00 p.m., I had left the west front of the Capitol after initially being at the scene, assessing what was going on, looking at just how looking at the violent actions that were taking place. Shortly thereafter, there was a phone call that was convened between several officials. Chief Son was on the call, literally pleading there were several Army officials that were on the call. I don't know all by name who were on the call. Several officials from district government that were on the scene. Chief Son was pleading for the deployment of the National Guard. And in response to that, there was not an immediate yes. The National Guard is responding. Yes, the National Guard is on the way. Yes, the National Guard are being restaged from traffic posts to respond. The response was more asking about the plan, what was the plan for the National Guard? The response was more focused on, in addition to the plan, the optics, how this looks with boots on the ground on the Capitol. And in my response to that was simply, I was just stunned that, I have officers that were out there literally fighting for their lives. And, we're kind of going through, what seemed like an exercise to really check the boxes. And there was not an immediate response. When I asked specifically, Chief Son, was he requesting the National Guard, and was that request being denied? The response was no. We're not. From the U.S. Department of the Army was no. We're not denying the request. But they were concerned. They did have concerns. So I was just stunned at that response.
And Major General William Walker also testified about that 2:30 p.m. call.
And at that time, Chief Conti and Chief Son passionately pleaded for District of Columbia National Guard to get to the Capitol with all deliberate speed. So the Army senior leaders did not think that it looked good, it would be a good optic. They further stated that it could incite the crowd. So their best military advice would be to the Secretary of the Army, who could not get on the call. So we wanted the Secretary of the Army to join the call, but he was not available. We were told that he was with the Secretary of Defense and not available. But the Army senior leadership expressed to Chief Conti, Chief Son, Dr. Mitchell, the Deputy Mayor, and others on the call that it would not be their best military advice to have uniformed guardsmen on the Capitol.
And Senator Gary Peters of Michigan followed up with Major General Walker.
General Walker, was the issue of optics ever brought up by Army leadership when the D.C. National Guard was deployed during the summer of 2020? Was that discussed?
It was never discussed the week of June. It was never discussed July 4th when we were supporting the city. It was never discussed August 28th when we supported the city.
Did you think that was unusual?
I did.
So there definitely was a difference in the way the Defense Department responded to protests that were attended by Black Lives Matter protesters, darker skinned people, and the people that were showing up for Donald Trump. It's just the truth. There was a difference. But when it comes to the Defense Department higher-ups, the people on the other end of that call saw what happened differently. So here is Lieutenant General Walter Piatt, the director of the Army staff, testifying on June 15th.
My involvement with our response to this emergency began shortly after entering the Secretary of the Army's office at 2:20 p.m. to provide a report of a suspicious package. While I was there, a panic call came in reporting several explosions in the city. To understand the situation and to identify what was needed from the Army, Secretary McCarthy convened a conference call. During this call, D.C. and Capitol authorities frantically requested urgent and immediate support to the Capitol. We all immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Secretary McCarthy ran down the hall to seek approval from the Acting Secretary of Defense. Before departing, he directed me to have the staff prepare a response. I communicated this on the conference call, but those on the line were convinced that I was denying their request, which I did not have the authority to do. Despite clearly stating 3 times that we are not denying your request, we need to prepare a plan for when the Secretary of the Army gains approval.
And here's what the Defense Department officials said happened after the call. Here's Robert Salesses of the Department of Defense.
At approximately 2:30 p.m., the Secretary of the Army met with the Acting Secretary of Defense and other senior leaders of the Defense Department. After this meeting, the Acting Secretary of Defense determined that all available forces of the D.C. National Guard were required to reinforce the D.C. Metropolitan Police and the U.S. Capitol Police, and ordered the full mobilization of the D.C. National Guard at 3:04 p.m. After reviewing the D.C. National Guard's missions, equipping, and responsibilities to be performed at the Capitol Complex in support of the Metropolitan Police and Capitol Police, and conferring with the D.C. Metropolitan Police at their headquarters at 4:10 p.m., the Secretary of the Army received the Acting Secretary of Defense's approval at 4:32 and ordered the D.C. National Guard forces to depart the Armory for the Capitol Complex.
4:32 is more than 2 hours after the Capitol building was breached. And so here's what General Walker said as the commander of the National Guard troops. Here's what he said he was doing in the meantime. Here he is being questioned by Senator Gary Peters of Michigan. And in case you don't know military time, 1500 is 3 p.m.
So I had them ready to go shortly after the phone call. So I brought, at 1500, I directed that the Quick Reaction Force that was based at Andrews Air Force Base leave the base, get to the Armory at all deliberate speed. I had a police escort bring them to the Armory. They returned to the Armory in about 20 minutes. So we had them sitting there waiting. And then in anticipation of a green light, a go, we put guardsmen on buses. We brought them inside the Armory so nobody would see them putting on the equipment and getting on the buses. And then we just waited to get the approval. And that's why we were able to get to the Capitol in about 18 minutes.
What time were they on the buses ready to go? Do you recall?
Before 5 o'clock. But at 5 o'clock, I decided, hey, there's got to be an approval coming. So get on the buses, get the equipment on, get on the buses, and just wait. And then a few minutes after that, we did get the approval. I was on a secure video conference when the Army leadership conveyed to me that the Secretary of Defense had authorized the employment of the National Guard at the Capitol. So my timeline has 17:08, 5:08 p.m. is when we wrote down that we had approval, and that was about 8 people in the office with me when I got that.
How many guardsmen were ready? You said right immediately, earlier in the afternoon.
About 155.
So you could have sent 155 much, much earlier. What would have been the impact of sending those 155 right around that 2 o'clock time frame?
Well, based on my experience with the summer, and I have 19 years, I have 39 years in the National Guard. I was in the Florida Guard, Hurricane Andrew. I've been involved in civil disturbances. So I believe that number could have made a difference. We could have helped extend the perimeter and help push back the crowd.
5:08 is when the National Guard was sent. The Capitol was breached at 2:11. And just like how the FBI report didn't get to where it needed to go in time to be of any use, communication was a problem for the Defense Department, too. Here's Robert Salesses of the Defense Department speaking to Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri.
That's when the Secretary of Defense made the decision at 4:32. As General Walker has pointed out, because I've seen all the timelines, he was not told that till 5:08. That's what.
How is that possible, Mr. Salazar? Do you think that the decision in the moment we were in was made at 4:32, and the person that had to be told wasn't told for more than half an hour after the decision was made?
Senator, I think that's an issue.
There are so many issues. Because this is what was possible if January 6th weren't being overseen by people who had their heads up their asses. Here's Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri speaking again to General Walker.
General Walker, if the restrictions on your authorities hadn't been put in place by DOD, what would you have done when Chief Sund called you at 1:49 on January 6th with an urgent request for National Guard assistance?
I would have immediately pulled all the guardsmen that were supporting the Metropolitan Police Department. They had the gear in the vehicles. I would have had them assemble in the armory and then get on buses and go straight to the armory and report to the most ranking Capitol Police officer they saw and take direction. And further, just let me add this. So one of my lieutenant colonels on his own initiative went to the Capitol anticipating that we were going to be called. So he would have been there, and he met with Deputy Chief Carroll of the Metropolitan Police Department, who asked him, where is the National Guard? How come they're not here? And this colonel said, well, I'm sure they're coming, and I'm here to scout out where they're going to be when they get here. So that was the plan. I would have sent them there immediately. As soon as I hung up, my next call would have been to my subordinate commanders, get every single guardsman in this building and everybody that's helping the Metropolitan Police, remission them to the Capitol without delay.
And Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin followed up on that.
How quickly could have you gotten how many people to the Capitol?
20 minutes.
How many people?
150.
And I think that could have made a difference. Now, for his role in all of this, here's how former Defense Secretary Chris Miller explained his reasoning for this extraordinary amount of micromanagement.
I want to remind you and the American public that during that time, there was irresponsible commentary by the media about a possible military coup, or that advisors to the president were advocating the declaration of martial law. I was also very cognizant of the fears and concerns about the prior use of the military in June 2020 response to protests near the White House. And just before the Electoral College certification, 10 former secretaries of defense signed an op-ed published in the Washington Post warning of the dangers of politicizing and inappropriately using the military. No such thing was going to occur on my watch. But these concerns and hysteria about them nonetheless factored into my decisions regarding the appropriate and limited use of our armed forces to support civilian law enforcement during the Electoral College certification. My obligation to the nation was to prevent a constitutional crisis. Historically, military responses to domestic protests have resulted in violations of Americans' civil rights, and even, in the case of the Kent State protests of the Vietnam War, tragic deaths. In short, I fervently believe the military should not be utilized in such scenarios other than as a last resort, and only when all other assets have been expended. I stand by every decision I made on January 6th and the following days. I want to emphasize that our nation's armed forces are to be deployed for domestic law enforcement only when all civilian assets are expended, and only as the absolute last resort. To use them for domestic law enforcement in any other manner is contrary to the Constitution and a threat to the Republic. I ask you to consider what the response in Congress and in the media had been if I had unilaterally deployed thousands of troops into Washington, D.C. that morning against the express wishes of the mayor and the Capitol Police, who indicated they were prepared.
Now, that's not really what we're pissed about here. It's more that the commander wasn't able to use the people that were on standby for this very purpose. But putting that aside, the man does have a point. I was really pissed off when the National Guard troops were present when the police cleared the street by the White House of actually peaceful protesters using rubber bullets and tear gas last summer. I yelled, "Posse comitatus," like a weirdo at the television set. Because the military isn't supposed to be used for domestic law enforcement. And we were worried that Trump would try to use the military in his self-coup attempt. And Capitol security was ultimately the responsibility of the Capitol Police, who, when offered standby troops by the Department of Defense, told the Defense Department, "Nah, we're all good." But check out the way that the concern for the Constitution was received by lawmakers, with Democratic Representative Mike Quigley of Illinois putting in one of the more disturbing performances.
If we had a valid request and a necessary request from your body I guarantee you that the Department of Defense would have been there in strength as required.
All right. So, well, you would acknowledge we lost the battle. We lost the building
yes,
for the first time since 1814.
Horrifying.
And it was everybody else's fault but DOD.
I absolutely disagree with the statement that it was everybody.
I'm paraphrasing you the only way that makes sense when you say you wouldn't do anything differently. You wouldn't do anything differently. Okay, that implies what I'm saying, that it was everybody else's fault in your mind, because it was a catastrophic failure.
And I just had an obligation to protect and defend the Constitution and guarantee that the armed forces were used appropriately and not in a manner that would be seen as extra constitutional.
Look, the Constitution is not a treaty of surrender. It affords you the opportunity to do what's necessary to defend the people and the democracy of the United States. I mean, if looked upon the destruction afterwards, looking back, you say, well, at least I defended the Constitution, is another perverse way of looking at this. Nothing was DOD's fault, and at least you did, in your own mind, defend what you thought was right for the Constitution. Never mind how many people got hurt and how much damage was done to our government in the meantime.
I will absolutely take that on and take that as a compliment, because the armed forces of the United States was completely prepared and ready to respond to any valid request from any department or agency or local or federal law enforcement office.
You lost, and you don't have the intestinal fortitude to own up to your part of the responsibility. And I get it. A lot of people screwed up. You're one of them. I yield back, Madam Chairwoman.
We'll respectfully disagree on that. Thank you for your
when I was in the room, you weren't.
How quickly they are to toss aside constitutional concerns when they are personally scared. But regardless, at the end of the day, on January 6th at 8 p.m., the Capitol was cleared and Congress got back to work, finishing the election certification that very night. 81 members of the Capitol Police and 58 members of the Metropolitan Police Department were assaulted during the riot. One officer, Brian Sicknick, who many in the media reported was beaten to death by the rioters, actually died after the riot of a stroke, which was confirmed by his wife. He was honored in a ceremony in Congress, as it should be. One rioter, 35-year-old military veteran Ashley Babbitt of California, was shot and killed as she tried to jump through a barricaded broken window into the hallway in the House of Representatives where members of Congress were still located. Two rioters, 55-year-old Kevin Greason of Alabama and 50-year-old Benjamin Phillips of Pennsylvania, died of heart attacks, and one rioter, 34-year-old Roseanne Boyland of Georgia, died of a drug overdose. California, Georgia, Alabama, Pennsylvania. The rioters that day came from all over this country. The people arrested so far have come from 44 of these 50 United States. Here's Yogananda Pittman. She became the acting chief of the Capitol Police after Stephen Sund resigned. And here's what she said about who the rioters were.
There's evidence that some of those who stormed the Capitol were organized. But there's also evidence that a large number were everyday Americans who took on a mob mentality because they were angry and desperate. It is the conduct of this latter group that the department was not prepared for.
We also heard testimony from the FBI, specifically from Jill Sanborn, who is the assistant director of the counterterrorism division of the FBI, about who they have found were involved in the Capitol riot.
We're seeing people that got caught up in the moment, got caught up in the sort of the energy, et cetera, and made their way into the Capitol. And those are probably the ones that you're seeing the charges simply of trespassing. And then we're definitely seeing that portion that you're pointing out, which is small groups and cells now being charged with conspiracy that coalesced either on site or even days or weeks prior and had sort of an intent that day. And they too probably caught people up in the energy.
And now that it's been 6 months, there have been some studies done about who these people were. And so here's Brian Jenkins. He is the senior advisor to the RAND president at the RAND Corporation.
Some recent research, not done by RAND, but done by the University of Chicago, looking at the people who were arrested for participation in the events on January 6th, based upon statements they made on their own Facebook accounts and so on, indicates that about 20% of them were actually members of extremist groups going in, that the remaining 80% were there because they felt the election had been stolen.
And as for those people that have been arrested, here is what they are being charged for. Here is Representative Pat Fallon of Texas speaking to FBI Director Christopher Wray.
Has anyone been charged with inciting an insurrection?
I think I responded to an earlier question. I don't believe that has been one of the charges used so far. But again, with that many cases, I want to build in a little room for the fact that I might not know all the cases.
But so as of right now, the answer would be no, fair to say?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Has anybody been charged with sedition, to your knowledge?
Same answer.
Okay, no again. Has anybody been charged with treason?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Has anyone been charged with illegal possession of a firearm inside the Capitol on that day?
I believe there has been at least one instance of someone arrested with a firearm in the Capitol, and there have been a number of arrests of individuals either en route to the Capitol or near the Capitol for the siege.
And I searched through the indictments just right before recording this episode, and I too could only find one person in the database charged with having a firearm in the Capitol building. His name was Christopher Alberts of Maryland, who had a semi-automatic handgun. He's been charged with unlawful possession of a firearm on Capitol grounds, carrying a pistol without a license, possession of a large-capacity ammunition feeding device, entering and remaining in a restricted building, assaulting a police officer, and other charges. He's facing possible decades in prison. The only other rioter charged with any other firearms-related charges is Lonnie Coleman, the 70-year-old dipshit with the arsenal in his pickup truck. In total, as of July 22nd, 586 people have been charged for their roles in the January 6th riot. Members of the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, and others are being handed the most serious charges, conspiracy charges, which are likely to have prison sentences. The group with the most members who have been indicted so far are the Proud Boys. There's an indictment filed against 4 of the Proud Boy leaders, and it alleges that they used their message boards to coordinate attendance at the January 6th rally that was announced by President Trump because they believed the election was being stolen. They used internet crowdfunding sites to raise funds to help pay for their members to travel to Washington, D.C., and to buy military-style tactical vests, protective gear, and radio equipment, not weapons. Before the riot, they coordinated what their members would wear and where they would meet. During the riot, they dismantled barricades that were surrounding the Capitol and eventually entered the Capitol to disrupt the joint session of Congress. The Proud Boys leaders were charged with 6 counts, including conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding of Congress, obstruction of law enforcement, and destruction of government property. After the riot, the indictment mentions that they celebrated the fact that they successfully stormed the Capitol unarmed, saying, quote, "We stormed the Capitol unarmed. We took it over unarmed," unquote. Another group, the Oath Keepers, recruits from former military and police officers. And on January 6th, 18 of them coordinated to attend the rally and eventually the riot, together to obstruct the joint session of Congress. And I'm getting all this from the confessions of 2 of them. One of those 18 Oath Keepers was a former Navy intelligence officer. And this group is fascinating to me because they brought weapons to Washington, D.C., but had them stashed in a hotel room, preparing for if then President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act and needed people to fight what they thought was a coup inside of the Capitol building. They planned to have their weapons there to mobilize, and this is their words, a quick reaction force to defend and fight for Trump's government. So we have the National Guard's 40-person quick reaction force and this rogue group of Oath Keepers, which included a naval intelligence officer, using the same tactics of the military on standby, waiting for commands from the same commander-in-chief. They said that they thought, the Oath Keepers here, that they were fulfilling their duties to the public and the U.S. Constitution with their actions because President Trump told them the election was being stolen. They said that they were aiming to obstruct the proceeding through the intimidation or coercion of members of Congress, and that they didn't plan to enter the Capitol until the opportunity arose. In their minds, based on their trust in the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, they thought they were defending our country from a coup. They were trying to prevent the government from being overthrown. At least 46 rioters were members of our military, some of them active duty. The FBI is looking for approximately 800 rioters total who entered the Capitol building, which means that about 5% of the rioters were members of our military. Ashley Babbitt, the only person who was shot and killed that day, was a military veteran. And I think that's really important because these are people who signed up to die for our country. They pledged to defend the Constitution. The president is their commander-in-chief that they are trained to obey. And in their minds, that's what they thought they were doing. And this is one of the reasons that I've been getting so upset that so many people are jumping on board the Democratic Party talking point by labeling all rioters traitors and insurrectionists. The situation is so much more nuanced than that. These are people who believed. They believed the lies of the W. Bush administration and went to fight in his illegal war. They put their lives on the line. They believed the Republican Party. They believed their Republican commander-in-chief. They didn't go to Washington, D.C. on a whim. They were summoned there by the President of the United States. The rally they were attending was called the Save America Rally. They chanted, "Stop the steal," as in stop the coup. They thought there was a coup happening inside that building. They were attempting to stop a coup, not enact one. That's the opposite of insurrection. And as Americans, we need to deal with all of that as it actually happened. Because the most common charge against the January 6th defendants is knowingly entering or remaining in a restricted building without authority, a kind of catch-all count for trespassing on restricted grounds. The second most common charge filed is disorderly or disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds. And the reason that those are the most common charges is because most of the rioters, as you just heard in testimony from the cops and the FBI, were not organized members of any group of loser wannabe militiamen. They were ordinary people who believed Donald Trump, so much so that they traveled to Washington, D.C. in the coldest, shittiest time of the year to protest what they thought was a coup. And let's just acknowledge that a big reason for that is that people trusted by society to tell us what's happening in the world, people we trust to inform us and put events into context for us, were instead serving political parties. And the ones serving the Republican Party did not explain to their viewers that they were being told lies. Donald Trump was not the only one lying to them. The people they trusted to explain the events of the world weren't informing them accurately, quite the opposite. One rioter's lawyer argued that his client had, quote, Fox mania, unquote, and had started believing in what was being fed to him by Fox News. Another lawyer said about his client, quote, the reason he was there is because he was a dumb and believed what he heard on Fox News, unquote. One lawyer who represents multiple participants in the riot called his clients, and this is a direct quote from the lawyer, this isn't me saying it, but he called all of his clients, quote, fucking retarded, unquote. We're talking about some of our dumbest, most gullible citizens here. And a sizable contingent of them were all in on QAnon. And I'll admit that I have dismissed QAnon. I didn't care to learn about it, and I have ignored everyone who has said anything to me about it for years. I have given it as much thought as I have given Bigfoot, as in damn near none. And maybe that was a mistake because it was a political movement. And that's what I didn't understand until I binge watched a 6-hour documentary about QAnon on HBO called Q Into the Storm. What I learned is that Donald Trump was a central savior figure in the QAnon cult. For whatever reason, when some anonymous person posting under the letter Q on message boards who claimed to be a Trump administration insider started posting anonymous information on 4chan and 8chan, a group of Americans that grew to number in the many thousands, if not millions, believed the stuff that they were told by a source they couldn't verify. They were told and believed that elites, most but not all of them Democrats, were Satan-worshiping, literal baby-eating pedophiles. They were horrified by that. And they also believed that Donald Trump was preparing a mass arrest of all of them. That day that the mass arrests would happen and the good guys would win, that would be the storm, the judgment day for all those terrible people doing unimaginably horrible things. But I didn't understand how central Donald Trump was to all of it. Q wasn't a thing before the Trump administration, and as far as I know, Q hasn't been a thing since he left office. January 6th, that was the day. That was the storm, or at least that's what they thought. And they thought the election was being stolen from this man they trusted, from Donald Trump. Donald Trump himself summoned them to Washington, D.C., and Trump had been egging them on by retweeting their leaders and quoting their slogans. The most disturbing of them being where we go one, we go all, something that Ashley Babbitt had on her social media. And what I also learned is that, that slogan is important because QAnon, it's more than just a bunch of ideas. It became a community of people who felt like outcasts, who found a community with each other. All you had to do to be accepted was to believe. They had rallies and conferences and house parties. They made merchandise. And one day you're a loser poster on the internet, and the next you're at a Q event being embraced by a whole community of people who hate the evil baby eaters too. And in this community, which was nationwide, Donald Trump was the savior. And he asked them to come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th to stop a coup. Now, of course, it was a lie. But in their weird reality, they were heroes for answering the good president's call. One such person was described this way by his lawyer, quote, "He fell victim to this barrage of internet-sourced info and came to the Capitol at the direction of the President of the United States to demonstrate that he was a true patriot," unquote. Now, I was on the air on January 6th with Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton on Politics. My initial thoughts are public. I also did a thank you episode 2 days later, and so my rage is documented. I get mad at Congress all the time. Clearly, I am crazy enough to do this for a living. Did it for years without pay because I am a nut. But I get mad at Congress because I love it. I love the potential of it. The fact that we get to elect our lawmakers and get to change our society without violence. I wish we took more care of that right and responsibility, but I love Congress. And the rioters trashed my Capitol building that day. I'm mad about it. I'm not minimizing what happened. I'm mad about it just like I get mad when I walk down Broadway in downtown Oakland at least once per year to find all the windows smashed and the stores looted. Riots are never the answer. And I'm mad at the people that did this. But I also think it's important for us to have some damn empathy for our fellow Americans. I've proven myself capable of having empathy for Black Lives Matter protesters who riot, as mad as I get about my own neighborhoods getting trashed, because they are getting murdered by authority figures who almost always do so with impunity. Officer Chauvin being an important but rare exception. And I have empathy for the MAGA rioters because they are Americans, some of the dumbest, most gullible Americans who answered a president's call. Yes, some of them are despicable people. The guy carrying the Confederate flag into the Capitol building has a special seat in hell reserved for him. But it's important, sad, and scary that the lies of Donald Trump inspired regular, good Americans to break the law and assist in trashing the Capitol. U.S. District Court Judge Emmett Sullivan said in one of the prosecution hearings that many of the rioters, quote, come to court with unblemished records. They never paid a fine over $50, unquote. One of them, who pled guilty to a misdemeanor count of demonstrating inside the Capitol, apologized to the court, saying she was ashamed of the violence and adding, quote, "At first it didn't dawn on me, but later I realized that if every person like me who wasn't violent was removed from that crowd, the ones who were violent may have lost the nerve to do what they did," unquote. Another rioter read an apology statement during his hearing that said, quote, "I allowed myself to put passion before my principles. This resulted in me violating the law for the first time in my life, which has weighed heavily on my conscience," unquote. There were good people who did a very bad thing in that riot crowd. And the fact that they were told by the President of the United States, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country, the fact that he told them to come to Washington, D.C., and that the election was in the process of being stolen, might actually be a defense that they can successfully use in court. In fact, it's being used by the lawyers for the QAnon shaman. The dumbass with the face paint and the horns who requested all organic food while he was in jail. We all know who he is. Well, the defense he's using actually has a name. It's called the public authority defense. Basically, if an authority figure invites you to commit an illegal act, that's a defense. And the spotlight is then supposed to turn towards the authority figure to ask them why they would do such a thing. The example used to describe this defense being successfully employed in the past in the article I read, which of course is in the show notes for you, but it involved a federally licensed gun dealer who told a gun buyer that his particular situation, whatever it was, qualified him for an exemption to the prohibition that felons can't own guns, and so he bought a gun from him. The court found that licensed gun dealers are federal agents for gathering and dispensing information about purchasing guns, and so it was reasonable for the felon to rely on the gun dealer's word, and the gun buyer was found not guilty. Another case where this defense was successfully used is even more relevant to January 6th. In 2007, 12 dum-dums were accused of plotting to overthrow the government of Laos. The U.S. Attorney's Office dropped the charges after their lawyer presented evidence that they were lured into the conspiracy by an undercover federal agent pretending to be a CIA officer. The dum-dums reasonably believed that they were acting on behalf of the American government and therefore weren't guilty of being part of a criminal conspiracy. And so with that in mind, let's remember the rioters' behavior that we all witnessed on January 6th. When they got into the building, they filmed it. They aired it live. And after the fact, they posted their videos and photos on the internet. They took selfies with cops on their way out. They bragged about what they did all over social media, which is how a lot of them are getting caught. If the rioters genuinely believed that they were acting at the direction of an authority figure, and I think the most powerful person in the country qualifies as an authority figure, then that explains why they would do that. If you think of yourself as a soldier doing the bidding of the commander-in-chief, you don't try to hide what you're doing. You would assume that you would be viewed as a hero and thanked for your service. You would want the world to know what you did. You would want the credit. I've been poring over the indictments of the MAGA rioters for a week, learning their individual stories. And while each of them is different, every single one of them thought the election was being stolen because the President of the United States told them so. They thought that the joint session of Congress was one of the last acts in a coup. And yet, this is how members of the ruling party in our current government are speaking about January 6th and the participants in the riot. Here's Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York.
Today, the committee will examine one of the darkest days in our nation's history, the January 6th insurrection at the United States Capitol. On that day, a violent mob incited by shameless lies told by a defeated president launched the worst attack on our republic since the Civil War. We watched as the temple of our democracy, a building we're as familiar with as our own homes, was overrun by a mob bent on murdering the vice president and members of Congress.
Here's Representative Kiwasi Mafumi of Maryland.
So that's what we are trying to do, keep our republic and to keep it from those who tried to overthrow this government, who wanted to kill members of Congress, who wanted to hang Mike Pence.
Here's Representative Jamie Herrera Butler of California.
The United States Capitol Police Force is not meant to be an army. Expecting 1,600 officers to hold back an unruly mob of 8,000 to 10,000 people, many of whom were armed and had their own homemade explosive devices or came with or weaponized everyday items. It's not a position we should ever have to be in.
And you know the facts now. That's not what happens. You haven't been living under the sea somewhere. You know that exaggerations like this are being lobbed by Democrats and their captured media figures all over the place, along with the brand that they've slapped on January 6th, the insurrection. In fact, while the Senate Democrats have been responsible with their words, calling January 6th either an attack or a riot in their report and hearing documents, the House Democrats have been officially calling January 6th an insurrection in their hearing names. On February 5th, Chairman Jim Himes of the House Committee on Financial Services named his hearing Dollars Against Democracy, Domestic Terrorist Financing in the Aftermath of Insurrection. On May 12th and June 15th, Chairman Carolyn Maloney, who you just heard, on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, named both of her hearings, quote, the Capitol Insurrection, Unexplained Delays and Unanswered Questions, unquote. And I've got to tell you, Maloney's hearings together were a total of 9.5 hours long and absolutely insufferable. The partisanship and childishness was so over the top, with Democrats exaggerating like you just heard on one side, and then Republicans saying stupid shit like this on the other. Here's Representative Andrew Clyde of Georgia.
Watching the TV footage of those who entered the Capitol and walked through Statuary Hall showed people in an orderly fashion staying between the stanchions and ropes taking videos and pictures. You know, if you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
No, definitely not. Jesus. And so I listened to the hearings in chronological order, and it was amazing to me how they changed as time went on. In the first hearings, the ones closest to January 6th, those hearings were really good. Members of both parties, and actually most of the clips you heard today came from the early hearings. But in those early hearings, members of both parties asked good questions, following up on previous questions, and there really wasn't much exaggeration or minimization at all. But once we got into May and June, especially in the House, that's when it got insufferably over the top. And so if you do want to watch any of it for yourselves, I recommend the Senate hearings from February and March. And you can also read the report they produced from their investigation, which, by the way, I may have mentioned this, but it was written by Democrats, and they referred to the event as an attack or a riot in their official documents. They did not call it an insurrection once. That word only appeared in the report when inside of a quote or as part of an article name in the sources section. But it's the exaggerations, especially the insurrection branding, that has me concerned for our future for a few reasons. First, January 6th exposed some serious security failures by the agencies responsible for keeping our elected representatives safe and preventing any real insurrections or overthrows by enemies from being successful. We know for sure that only one person out of approximately 800 rioters that got into the building had a gun. When real insurrections happen, the people involved are there to take over the government. Insurrections are acts of war, and people bring guns and swords and tanks to war. They don't arm themselves with flagpoles or whatever they find on the ground. The MAGA idiots got into the Capitol building essentially unarmed. They didn't have to shoot their way in. Flagpoles and batons were enough. And can you imagine what could have happened if they didn't leave their weapons at the Comfort Inn? If they showed up guns in hand and prepared to kill? If the Capitol Police couldn't fend off Trump's flagpole waving dummies, can you imagine what could have happened if they had met a well-coordinated mob with bullets? January 6th could have been so much worse. We got so lucky. And the Capitol Police clearly needs some major reforms after such an epic failure. And yet, because this is being branded as an insurrection by the party currently ruling our government, because that kind of exaggeration is not being laughed out of the room, here's how the Capitol Police chief from January 6th, who thankfully has resigned, but here's how he's explaining what happened that day. Here's Stephen Sund.
It was very similar to the intelligence assessments that we had for the November and December MAGA marches. The intelligence assessments that we had developed for the January 6th event, all the way up until January 6th, we're all saying very much the same thing, and that's what we had planned for. We had planned for the possibility of violence, the possibility of some people being armed, not the possibility of a coordinated military-style attack involving thousands against the Capitol.
No. 800 stormed the building, and they had military-style protective gear, not military-style weapons like the ones we so often see shoot up our movie theaters, nightclubs, and elementary schools here in America. A coordinated military-style attack, an insurrection, that's a worst-case scenario situation, which this was not. The Capitol was breached by unarmed morons who left their real firepower outside, except for the one dude who didn't even use his gun that he brought into the Capitol building. By branding January 6th as the worst case scenario, that is serving as a cover-up for their security fuck-up. As if they were prepared, but January 6th was so extreme that it just couldn't be defended. Like, sure, we failed, but this attack was so epic that it's understandable. And that's bullshit. And the Democrats refusing to call bullshit on that exaggeration. And even worse than that, doubling down on it and branding it all over the television and radio and anywhere else that they're being heard as an insurrection. They are helping to excuse the level of failure that occurred by the Capitol Police Board, which, let's remember, is made up of 3 people, 2 of whom were chosen by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They are covering up the failure of the Capitol Police Board to prepare ahead of time for the ruckus we could all see being planned by the president on his Twitter feed, and the failure of the Capitol Police to manage the riot once the rioters got through the 3-foot-tall barricades they put up that I'm familiar with from the electrical light parade at Disneyland. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky summarized the situation quite perfectly.
We can talk all we want about January 6th, but really it's the decision-making leading up to that. Someone made a bad judgment call, and we need to be better prepared. If we want to fix this in the future, it isn't about calling the National Guard out quicker. It's about having 1,000 people standing there before the riot happens so the riot doesn't happen.
Amen. And the fact is that we all knew something big and weird could go down on January 6th. I am a Congress watching super nerd, and I have never watched an election certification because there's no point. It's a ceremonial thing. Which is another point worth mentioning. January 6th was the wrong day in the wrong location to try to overturn the election or stage an overthrow of the government or whatever people are being accused of trying to do that day. The states do the actual certifications, and that was finished in mid-December. That was the real last chance to, make Trump the president besides his loss. Congress was basically reading the results into the record. It's almost always a 30-minute nothing burger of a joint session of Congress. But on January 6th, 2021, I set an alarm to watch it. Why? Because Donald Trump was promising something wild. We all saw him tell people to go to Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Donald Trump, the president, he organized it. Conspirators are being charged with coordinating their arrivals and what they would bring, but the main conspirator was Donald Trump, who told them out in the open where to be on January 6th. The FBI didn't need to break any encryption to see that planning happening. We all knew. And while the rioters thought the election was being stolen because of Trump's lies, we have Donald Trump caught on tape trying to get Georgia election officials to find him the exact number of votes that he would need to flip the state, and threatening them with criminal charges if they didn't do it.
If we could just go over some of the numbers, I think it's pretty clear that we won. We won very substantially, Georgia, but we've had hundreds of thousands of ballots that we're able to actually. We'll get you a pretty accurate number. You don't need much of a number because the number that, in theory, I lost by the margin would be 11,779. And even if you cut them in half, and cut them in half again, it's more votes than we need.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
And you will be at 11,779 within minutes. It's more illegal for you than it is for them because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Riot, your lawyer. That's a big risk. So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state, and flipping the state is a great testament to our country, because, so what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
Donald Trump conspired to bring rioters to D.C. right out in the open. He held an illegal, unpermitted rally near the Capitol. He attempted to use his power to coerce election officials to change the results for him. These are crimes. Terry Canfield and Mark Reichel, who are the authors of the article I read about the public authority defense, put it really well, even though they call the riot an insurrection, which is inaccurate. But regardless, they said, quote, "How would it look to a jury if the people who incited the failed insurrection went free, while the victims of lies and disinformation paid the price? Such an outcome would be offensive to the idea of fairness and equal justice for all," unquote. And yet that seems to be what's happening here. How is Donald Trump still a free man under no indictment for any of this? And that doesn't seem to be the focus of the Democrats. They're focused on the riot, as if the riot is the only part of Trump's attempt to stay in power that matters. His lies were the main cause of all of it. We had a president of the United States that betrayed the Constitution to try to maintain his own power. And we need to grapple with why people believed him and tried to help him. We need to help people who still believe him, because there are plenty of people that do. We need to help them understand how our system actually works and how we know his lies are lies. And we need to change the structure of authority in D.C. so that a rogue president can't stop law enforcement from responding to an attempted coup. Even though he didn't do that, Trump did give the needed authorities. And even though the rioters were not trying to overthrow the government, we can see so easily now how Donald Trump had the authority to hold back the National Guard. We can see how easily an actually armed mob with, the ability to kill could get into the Capitol building. And if they wanted to, they could have killed members of Congress. We have to acknowledge the problems as they are in order to solve them. And my fear is that the exaggerations are preventing us from doing that. And even worse, might lead to Congress enacting laws that either don't solve the problems or create far worse ones. Because this is how January 6th and the deceived American citizens who rioted to help a lying president are being described in the halls of Congress. Here's Representative Yvette Clarke of New York.
We cannot parse words. This was an act of domestic terrorism, an attack on our citadel of democracy.
Here's Christopher Rodriguez, the director of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency.
I appear today to discuss the January 6th attack that led to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which, based upon my experience, was clearly an act of domestic terrorism.
Here's the director of the FBI.
We consider the attack on the Capitol on January 6th to be a form of domestic terrorism.
And just in case you're thinking, good, those MAGA rioters. Here's Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut.
While we all lived through a brutal event on January 6th, undertaken by right-wing extremists, no location on the political spectrum has a monopoly on extremism or violence.
Here's Representative Michael Cloud of Texas talking to the FBI director.
You mentioned domestic terrorism, that this would qualify as that. Would the riots that we saw across the cities for nights and nights and weeks on, even months on end, qualify as domestic terrorism as well?
We've been treating both as domestic terrorism and investigating both through our Joint Terrorism Task Force.
And they're comparing where we are now to the post-9/11 period. Here's Christopher Rodriguez again, the director of the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency.
The threats we now face are arguably as dangerous as they were in the post-9/11 environment, and these threats are not going away.
You remember what happened after 9/11, right? The Fourth Amendment was basically erased from the Constitution. They created an illegal digital spying network that collected the digital communications of literally the entire world. And when they got caught, they just legalized it. After 9/11, they tortured people. They took human beings and put them in prison with no charges for decades. In fact, there are still 39 people who haven't been charged with anything rotting in Guantanamo Bay. And no one seems to even think about them anymore. And maybe we don't give a shit because they're foreigners. But it was the new terrorism laws that made all of that possible after 9/11. The war authorizations, the Patriot Act. Now, those laws were aimed at outsiders, but for 20 years, we've done nothing. We haven't even fired the very humans that wrote and enacted those laws in Congress. Many of those same exact people are still writing our laws. And now, using the Capitol riot as the reason, they are openly discussing aiming those types of laws at us. Here's Representative Alyssa Slotkin of Michigan.
The post 9/11 era of security, where the threats come from abroad, is over. In the 20 years of the post 9/11 era, they came to an end on January 6th. The new reality is that we have to come to terms with is that it's our extremists here at home seeking to exploit internal divisions that pose the greatest threat.
And here's Representative Michael McCall of Texas, a Republican. This is bipartisan, speaking in a hearing on February 4th.
I think that what happened on January 6th, when you look at the USA Patriot Act, they actually defined domestic terrorism and international, but they never included any charges or penalties for domestic terrorism. They only did it for international. I think it was because in 2001, they were more focused on foreign terrorists like Al-Qaeda, those responsible for 9/11. But the definition says activities that involve dangerous acts to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or any state that appear to be intended to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction. I think the Capitol attack seems to fit squarely within that definition.
And they're discussing their plans for the future. Here's Senator Gary Peters of Michigan.
But the January 6th attack must mark a turning point. There can be no question that the domestic terrorist threat, including violence driven by white supremacist and anti-government groups, is the gravest terrorist threat to our homeland security. Moving forward, the FBI, which is tasked with leading our counterterrorism efforts, and the Department of Homeland Security which ensures that state and local law enforcement understands the threats that American communities face, must address this deadly threat with the same focus and resources and analytical rigor that they apply to foreign threats such as ISIS and al-Qaeda.
And they are calling witnesses to tell them how to do that. Here's Daniel Glazer. He used to be the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the U.S. Department of the Treasury.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about how the U.S. government can employ similar tools and strategies against white nationalists and other domestic terrorist groups, as it has employed against global jihadist groups over the past 2 decades.
And here's the time frame they are discussing for how long this shit's going to go on. Here's Elizabeth Newman. She's the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security.
There are many other complicating factors I can't go into at this moment, but sadly, I do believe that we will be fighting domestic terrorism that has its roots and inspiration points from January 6th for the next 10 to 20 years.
And here's what she wants to see happen.
I urge that at a minimum, we change our laws to ensure equal justice, treating threats from ideologies that originated overseas and within the United States the same.
And I'm not the only person who's concerned about this. Here's testimony from Iman Bukadoum. She is and I probably didn't say that correctly, but she is the senior manager of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. This is what she warned Congress on February 25th.
We know, however, that even well-intentioned national security laws are invariably weaponized against Black, Brown, and Muslim communities, and that white nationalist violence is not prioritized, making that policy failure the fundamental reason for what transpired on January 6th, not lack of legal authority. For this reason, we oppose any legislation that would create new charges for domestic terrorism or any enhanced or additional criminal penalties. The federal government, including the Treasury Department, has many tools at its disposal to investigate, and also the FBI and DOJ have 50 statutes, at least 50 statutes, and over a dozen criminal statutes, 50 terrorism-related statutes, and over a dozen criminal statutes that they can use. They just need to use them to target white nationalist violence.
We don't need any more terrorism laws. And we definitely don't need them as a response to January 6th. Because terrorism laws, whether foreign or domestic, enact harsher penalties for ideologies being connected to crimes, for ideas. There were about 800 people who had the wrong idea that a coup was happening inside the Capitol building, and that Donald Trump and their political party was somehow being robbed, and they're being branded domestic terrorists. But there were at least a few thousand more Americans who had the same ideas and stayed outside the building. And there were millions of additional Americans across this country that didn't show up in D.C., but thought the same thing, that the election was being stolen. They were on the MAGA rioters' side. And so are we going to label the people who believed Trump's lies and who supported the MAGA rioters to be terrorist sympathizers? Because they did share the ideology. They had the same ideas. You know, are we really going to brand all Trump supporters as domestic enemies? Because that's what we're doing when we refer to the riot as an insurrection, as an act of civil war. We are branding the Americans who were there and who supported their leader as domestic terrorists, as enemies of this country. And by extension, anyone who shares their views would be terrorist sympathizers. We need to have some empathy for our fellow Americans. For our fellow humans, for Christ's sake, because it's not okay that our terrorism laws are allowing us to kidnap and kill without trials people overseas either. But do we really want to allow January 6th to be labeled an act of war, to justify more terrorism laws, more powers for the government aimed this time at us? And so that's my second concern. And for my next main episode, I have collected the names of every bill that was mentioned in the 30 hours of testimony that I watched, and I'm going to read them all to see what kind of changes to laws are being pursued by those who are elevating the riot to the level of war. I'm going to read the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. I'm going to read the Confronting the Threat of Domestic Terrorism Act. I'm going to read the Domestic Terrorism Penalties Act. And I'm going to study Section 311 of the Patriot Act, which they are specifically discussing wanting to turn against Americans. And there's a few more bills that have been written as a response to January 6th too. And I'll read those to see if the solutions match the problems that we heard exposed when it comes to Capitol security today. But laws are being written right now, domestic terrorism laws. And every single time you use the word insurrection to describe the riot, you are helping to spread the propaganda they are using to justify these bills. So I think you should at least know what exactly you're helping them do. And I think I can have that episode finished by mid-August. But out of all of this, I also have concerns that we're squandering an opportunity. We need to be honest about what happened that day, because exaggerating the riot to the level of war amongst each other is not going to help us deal with the problem that the MAGA rioters were, and maybe still are, living in another reality. When where Trump is honest and the election was stolen. We need to deal with that, and not by giving government the power to dictate what can and can't be posted on the internet, or giving the government the power to break our encrypted text messages. We need to help our friends, family members, neighbors, friends know how to spot the difference between truth and bullshit. And there's an opportunity to come together to do that here. Because these are the people, the MAGA Republicans, who again believed George W. Bush when he said Iraq had WMDs and that we needed to go to war to save the world. These are the people who believed it to the point that they signed up to physically risk their lives in those wars. They sent their children to fight in those wars. They have voted for Republicans in election after election. These are the people who were Team Republican, ride or die, loyal as hell to that party. A party that has allowed their bosses to financially starve them. A party that destroyed our financial safety net so that we'll be forced to take any job we can find. A party that allowed the health insurance companies to charge them ever more out of pocket. A party that allows the banks to bleed their checking accounts dry with hidden fees. These were people who were on Team Republican, but have had no idea what the Republican Party actually stands for and does with their power. These are people that believed to the point that they traveled from 44 states when called by the president to physically defend Donald Trump's Republican government from what they believed to be a coup. These people were so bullshitted, and now they know it. I feel like a lot of us have had a moment when we broke out of our political party spell. Mine was when we launched the Iraq War while I was living in Germany, and then I returned to the States to discover that I knew things from living over there that Americans didn't know about the war back here at home. That was the moment that I realized for sure that I was being bullshitted as an American on a scale I didn't actually think was possible, and it changed my entire life. January 6th, after being assured that the election was being stolen, the election was certified. Republican officials, after the riot, said the election was not, in fact, stolen. After the riot, Trump abandoned his most loyal maggots. He hasn't paid their legal bills. He hasn't come to their defense. He didn't send in the military to back them up and stop the steal. He was full of shit, and he abandoned them. And you can look it up on the internet. There's a bunch of videos of these people crying because Trump let them down. And then Joe Biden was inaugurated. And now Joe Biden is president. And it doesn't feel good to know that you were duped. I voted for George W. Bush in my first election right after I turned 18. I was on Team Republican, and I will regret that vote for the rest of my life. But I didn't know who they were. I didn't know their history and the extent of their lies. I didn't know what the Republican Party did with power until I did. And now with the whole Trump thing, that's got to be a moment for some of these people. Quite a few of the rioters in their confessions have said so. But, then we have the Democrats and the DNC-aligned corporate media. They just spent 2 years telling everyone that Trump was a Russian agent, which turned out to be lies too. And now they're showing no empathy whatsoever for those that trusted the lying president. And I think that's the struggle, who to trust. I think that's the question we're all grappling with. Can't we have some empathy for each other in this time when all of us feel like we don't know who to believe? All of us are experiencing a crisis of trust in our government, in media, all of us. That's the tie that binds us all. None of us know who to trust. We're all being bullshitted. More and more of us know it, and we're all stuck in this government together. And so how about we not brand everyone who was duped in the MAGA kind of way as terrorists and terrorist sympathizers? How about we welcome our fellow Americans into the reality realm with open arms instead of throwing their ignorance in their faces and even worse, telling them to go fuck off because they're insurrectionist enemies? You know, so many people who are screaming insurrectionists are accusing the MAGA rioters of attempting to start a civil war as if it's a bad thing. Because it's a horrible thing to start a civil war. How about we not make sure that the Civil War launch was successful? You know, I'm not at war with my elderly, wheelchair-bound, dumb but sweet QAnon cousin. I'm not at war with my Tea Party attending ex. They are not terrorists or terrorist sympathizers, but they do spend a lot of time on social media, on the internet, and the algorithms, which are designed to addict us to the platforms, are feeding them more and more of the content they engage with and filtering out the posts of people they follow, but don't cause them to comment in rage. You know, I used to love Twitter when it was chronological. I follow a few hundred people and I could see what they were thinking about in the moment. Some might be talking about movies, some were talking about food, some were thinking about the government. But I'm, you know, whatever this is, and I tend to respond to the government tweets. I tend to click on the articles about what's happening in the world. And now my Twitter is a political hellscape. I don't see tweets from the vast majority of the people that I follow. Twitter feeds me what they think I will react to. They'll show me tweets that are 2 days old. They'll show me the same tweets over and over again just to be like, by the way, did you see Glenn Greenwald said this? You know, they're filtering my reality. And Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, they're all doing it too. These companies don't need to be given the power to delete what we say, but they should probably be stripped of the power to determine what we see. Because when I think of January 6th, after watching the QAnon documentary and reading so many indictments and articles about the individual rioters, I think we need to solve the reality problem. I want to understand how my sweet cousin and my ex, who I will always adore, think things that are simply batshit crazy. But creating laws that punish people based on their ideas is not the answer. That much I know for sure. And that's what terrorism laws do. Even aiming these laws just at groups of known assholes like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers is problematic, as explained to Congress by Brian Jenkins, the senior advisor to the Rand president, on February 4th.
What many mean by a new domestic terrorism statute is a domestic version of the material support provision of the Patriot Act, which criminalizes providing material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. Now, that requires designating domestic terrorist groups, and there's the problem. There are hundreds of extremist groups on both ends of the political spectrum, along with other issue-oriented groups that conceivably might be labeled terrorist organizations. Battle lines will be drawn as each party proposes its preferred list. The contentious debate could distract us from the problem, and it could end badly. My advice is to avoid the terrorism as much as possible and base prosecutions on existing criminal offenses, putting aside the political pretensions of the perpetrators.
And Brian Jenkins, who I found to be a very refreshing voice of reason, he told this to Congress too.
Within that broader community, there are individuals who feel marginalized, people who have lost faith in our political systems. This is on both sides of the political spectrum. And what we have to do in our zeal to go after the violent component is not accidentally brand as enemies of the state a broader section of our population. Now, that is a continuing strategy, and that's one of the reasons, actually, why I want so much of our efforts against the violent extremists to be done within the ordinary criminal code. Put aside the political pretensions. Don't give them that. These are crimes: murder, assault, willful destruction of property. Deal with it on that basis.
And I am legitimately happy to see that the January 6th riot is being taken seriously in these hearings all year and that there have been so many hearings. And I'm legitimately happy to know that the Justice Department is finding the rioters wherever they are all over the country and charging them appropriately. In lots of ways, we're witnessing our system working despite all of this partisan noise. Our system did survive what happened that day. Congress finished the certification before bedtime. Joe Biden is our president. We got all of this information and practical solutions have been identified. The rioters are being brought to fair justice, and I'm happy that the Justice Department isn't bending to the rhetoric of the ruling party and overcharging these people. You know, from what I read about the individuals and their charges, they overall seem fair for what each person was responsible for that day. We saw an epic failure on January 6th, but we're also witnessing our system working. And so now I'm just hoping that we don't let Congress fuck that up. And I'll let you know if that's their plan in Congressional Dish 237. Okay, so that is the end of this episode. Thank you for listening and for, if you're going to disagree with me, doing it respectfully. I know that I can't stop this debate from continuing when I air an episode like this, especially with the second half of it, but let's be kind to each other. That's kind of my entire point of view right now, is let's be kind to each other in life and in political discussions. Before we wrap this up, I do have two quick announcements to make. One is I want to hang out with you. And so if you are in the Nashville area or want to be, on August 5th at 5 p.m. at the Scoreboard Bar and Grill, we're going to be having a meetup. Now, the Scoreboard Bar and Grill is in the Opryland area. It's not in downtown, so it will have its own parking lot. And we picked this place for the meetup because it's walking distance from Podcast Movement, where I'm going to be hosting the new attendee orientation. It's also outdoors, and so it's less likely to turn into a Delta super spreader. And they use real cheese on their nachos. Now, that last part is bullshit. That was not a determining factor, but it is in fact true, and it's a sign of a quality establishment because nacho cheese is not food, and any restaurant that uses it on their nachos is cheap and is serving you literal garbage. And don't at me on that either, especially because I eat it too. I eat everything. I'm a garbage eater, but real cheese is what should be used on nachos, especially in a restaurant. And by the way, I host another podcast called Talking Fat. So if you want to hear more of my thoughts on food and my 14 years in counting on Weight Watchers, check out Talking Fat, available in all of the main podcast apps. But the point is that I want to meet you in person. And so does Justin Robert Young of Politics, and Andrew Heaton of The Political Orphanage, who will also be there for your meeting pleasure. And we promise to be there for at least an hour because we have reserved the right for ourselves to bail if it's too hot or if assholes show up or if we just feel like leaving. And so since you're not an asshole, I definitely want to meet you. So please be on time. 5 p.m. on August 5th at the Scoreboard Bar and Grill in the Opryland area of Nashville. And I will be the tall, white, nervous chick holding a cold light beer. And last, I would also like to thank our executive producer for this episode, Forrest Pittman. Forrest Pittman contributed $535, the exact amount on the nose that qualified him for an executive producership. So your name is going to be listed right up there on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and everywhere this episode is found as the executive producer. It's a real credit. We will vouch for it if you want to put it on your LinkedIn or want it vouched for whatever reason works for you, but it's a real credit. You paid a significant portion of the production cost for this episode, so thank you very much. And Forrest didn't want his thoughts shared on air, but if you would like to be an executive producer, you do get your ability to have your thoughts shared at the end of a main episode instead of a thank you episode. But Forrest wanted to keep his thoughts between him and I, and that is great. Thank you for producing this episode. And thank you to all producers. And so I will be back with a thank you episode next week. And now I am done with this episode, which is good because I am starving. So I hope you are well. I hope you are not too mad at me for not being angry enough with the MAGA rioters. I don't know. I'm just feeling a lot of empathy for everyone right now. And I don't think that's a bad thing. So yeah, I love you all, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.